Have I been on mute all this time?
I think so.
Are you going to do the dance thing at the beginning?
What is the dance? Oh, well, maybe after. Let's keep our composure at the beginning.
I don't know what you're talking about. So.
It's the thing that, yeah, go ahead, you say, yeah.
Yeah, so we are live, by the way. All right.
He does this every time.
I do that every time because it is more natural to have a random start. It sets the tone of the conversation. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are having a great conversation. Well, it will be a great conversation today.
Started, right?
We haven't started yet. It will be about machine learning, ethics, governance, and all of these good things. So we have two awesome guests with us today. So Roxana, my co-host, you probably are familiar with her already. But let's get a very quick 30-second intros from Willie and Somaya to start. Willie, do you want to get us started?
Sure. I'm Willie Costello. I'm a data scientist at Shopify. Before becoming a data scientist, I was a philosopher, and I've been involved with ethics and related stuff with Aggregate Intellect for the last 2 years now, I think.
And Somaya.
Hi, everyone. This is Somaya Nekpour. I am an advocate, a researcher, and working at the intersection of data, AI, and policy. I am very passionate about the responsible development and application of AI system. And I've also been involved with AI ethics and with the ACE for the past 2 years. I'm currently the lead for the data science team working for the federal government of Canada. And thanks for having me.
Excellent. So usually at the beginning of these sessions, we say what we are drinking, but I don't have my tea. I just have water today. Are you all drinking anything? Oh, you're drinking water too.
I have water as well. I didn't get the memo that we were supposed to bring interesting drinks.
I know. I keep forgetting to do that. All right. So,
signature move.
What's that?
That's Serena's signature move. She's the one.
Yeah, exactly. I want things to be really random. All right. So let's get the conversation started. So there are a lot of different terms that I personally use interchangeably related to the topic we want to talk about. And I've heard people use it interchangeably, but they're probably not the same thing. So where I want us to start a conversation is a bit of disambiguation about those topics. So there are things like trustworthy AI, responsible AI, sustainable AI, ethical AI. What else did I say? Sustainable AI, human in the loop AI. Probably the list is very, very long. So maybe we can say what each of these mean very quickly so that we are all on the same page. Because as Somaya pointed out when we were talking before we went live, probably each of us also have a slightly different definition of each of these. So setting the scene at first, I think, would be helpful. So maybe Somaya, you can get us started. Pick one of them, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, sure. I can start with the responsible AI. So this is how I see it. I see it as a framework, sort of an umbrella framework that involves a lot of specific terms that, as the terms that you actually mentioned, things about talk about fairness, transparency, explainability. All these aspects, all these elements falls under this framework, which is responsible development of AI or responsible AI, which is going to address challenges around the development of AI system in order to make sure they are ethical and legal. This is how I see it. So.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds right to me. I think like my general opinion about all these terms is that like they're really just buzzwords, and there's a reason that they're used interchangeably. I think like there aren't clear meanings to them, that in a lot of cases people do sort of mean the same vague thing by them. I think they all point to this fact that like people just generally have these like background worries about something's maybe potentially going wrong with AI, but we're not being very precise about what it is. But I don't want to see there being like a sharp difference between like, are you for responsible AI or trustworthy AI or fair AI? Choose. I think like just pick your poison, go with that, and let's talk about the actual issues.
For the human in the loop one, I've heard quite a few different variations. So one of them is kind of having a team, interdisciplinary team from the beginning before you even set the problem that the algorithm is going to solve. And then those experts kind of monitoring along the way and post deployment. But then the other part, which kind of relates to what I do a bit more, is how the user, let's say we're talking about digital health app and the healthcare space, how the user can give feedback. This is appropriate. This is useful. This doesn't work, and so on. And then that somehow behind the scenes gets acted upon to improve that service.
So am I right to say that, as you pointed out, these are different variations of slightly different things, but generally the same thing. For example, probably sustainable AI is more relevant to when we talk about environmental effects of using AI, for example. Ethical AI is around, ethical dilemmas that we have as humans and machines will have as well. Responsible AI, as somebody said, broad category that captures probably a bunch of these. Probably you have to be sustainable, ethical, etc., in order to be responsible. But in general, is it true that in order to handle a lot of these, we are largely relying on frameworks and processes and governance? Is that the right way to think about it, or is there a different way to think about it?
No one wants to contradict you.
I think again, it's good to have a framework. Always, it's because it keeps people on the same page. Everybody comes with different perspective, and then if they want to get their perspective, they want to get their inputs into this, and let's say into development of an AI system. I think it's always good to have a framework to bring everybody on the same page, and then decide, well, okay, this is what we're going to do, and these are the stuff we have to take into consideration. I also want to mention something about what Roxana mentioned about human in the loop and human-centered AI. So, and I've seen sometimes people even use them interchangeably, but based on what I've studied or what I know is usually human in the loop is referred to those cases that there is an AI system needs to make a decision, but we don't want to rely on that system just to be the final decision maker. We bring a human to kind of vet that decision if needed. But when we talk about the human-centered AI, we are talking about having an interdisciplinary of people bringing their own background, their own knowledge into this process of development of an AI system. So it could be at any stage of this development, not necessarily at the end and the final stage.
I'm really happy we started with this kind of, bringing some light upon these terms. I do want to throw away towards you guys a buzzword that everyone talks about, but I really do think it means different things to different people. The whole concept of black box AI being a black box, and then how does that tie in to interpretable AI? Because in so many fields, if we're talking about healthcare, if we're talking about security, we want to really understand to some degree. And I'm not sure how much we do.
And I guess I add one more piece to it. Is there a difference between interpretable AI and explainable AI?
Yeah, there is. And there's even a third one that you hear sometimes called justifiable AI. So you can think about a difference between, explaining how an algorithm reaches decisions, an algorithm actually being able to interpret those decisions and make sense of them in human terms, and then also kind of arrive at decisions that are justified kind of rationally by our human considerations. So those are all different, or they can be distinguished. Though I often think what everyone was really getting at when they first started talking about explainable AI is, I think, ultimately what people are talking about when they talk about justifiable AI. And this is again why I think like, you know, the terms are helpful. They kind of like get us moving in a certain direction, but you know, they don't like settle the challenges.
No, I quite agree. And I really like this justifiable, because in a lot of cases that the decision needs to be made on extreme cases. I'm not necessarily talking about AI, even in legal in legal cases, they want to justify that decision, that case. So I feel like it's more relevant. But I can add also something about that interpretability. I feel like this comes from stat. So in statistics, building the causality, it's really important, and being able to interpret the results is the basic of a statistical inference, right? And when it kind of comes to machine learning, then it got difficult to do that, because you have a lot of time models that they are not necessarily standard statistical model, which you can interpret the result. So that's why in those cases, you can say, okay, it can be a black box, because we cannot, in statistical terms and in technical terms, interpret how this input turned out to be this output.
Are there like a set of algorithms that they're more black box than others and shouldn't be used in very high impact fields like law, security, health? Like, is there a point from an algorithm perspective where we draw the line?
Okay, so I'm going to throw out a controversial opinion, which is that I think like all of the black box talk is a distraction from what really matters. And I think talking about like the black box problem, which is like, so I'm understanding this as like the idea that the problem here is that we can't understand or explain what's going on in these algorithmic decision-making systems, just like, you know, decisions are being made, outputs are coming out, and we don't know how they're arriving at that answer. Saying that's the problem makes it sound like, well, it's just a technological problem. Like what we need is some sort of like technological solution, maybe some like explainable, interpretable AI, some way of kind of peeking within the black box and kind of explaining what's going on. And we need to rely on, you know, fancy machine learning engineers to help us there. So yeah, I just think like, here's why I think this is not really a problem. Like, it's not as if like, if you had a non-black box model, if you had like a perfectly explainable model, and you could like see, you know, you had some like logistic regression model, you could see the coefficients and you could actually like, you know, maybe easily draw some conclusions of like, here's how it reached its decision. It's not like when we get there that like any of the problems are solved. Like, I think like knowing how something makes its decision isn't necessarily going to fix anything. We need to know like, well, is there going to be any recourse for appeal for this decision? Like, it doesn't matter, like, and is it making its decision like on the right grounds? So, you know, you can imagine a black box algorithm that's saying like, we can't tell you why we denied you bail. And you can imagine like a white box algorithm where it's like, we denied you bail because of your race and your previous like criminal history. Like that second thing is no better. And if like there's no way of pushing against it, you know.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what you're saying is that explainability is probably necessary for trustworthiness, responsibility, etc., but is not sufficient. So that's sort of the baseline. Like you can explain, for example, a certain country invading another country, why that's happening, but is that responsible or ethical, etc., right? So
yeah, and the other thing I'll say is that I think like focusing just on what's kind of happening within the model, kind of within the black box, distracts us away from thinking about all of the other things that are being set up about the model. Like, because you can know nothing about a model's architecture, and you can ask really good questions about what's its training data like what sort of things are you optimizing the model for? How are you actually using those outputs to make decisions? You don't need to know the first thing about whether it's a neural net or, you know, just like a summing algorithm. And those are really good questions. And I think like those are where a lot of the really meaningful ethical questions actually lie.
Right. So speaking of high stake, use cases. Toronto police recently wanted to start using AI, and they did something interesting, which was they wrote up whatever came to mind, probably in terms of, these are the ways we want to use AI, and posted it online and asked for public feedback on it. So
Okay, wait. Just before we get into this, I'm
Okay.
going to correct the record. So first of all, Toronto police have already been using AI technologies.
Okay.
Let's just put that on the record. So they're not just asking for permission.
I
They're
see.
like
Okay.
in part asking for forgiveness. Second, they didn't just throw this together. Like the policy that they released was like very, very well researched.
Okay.
They consulted like many external stakeholders, experts in these fields, and like we'll talk more about the policy now. But like it's not just a slap together effort.
Good.
And
So
it was
So it was a thoughtful document that was prepared by the police, and even the fact that they asked for public feedback, I think, is an indication of that they were being intentional and they were not just doing whatever came to mind first. So thanks for the clarification. But what was it like? What was the proposal saying?
So Maya, do you want to take this? Should I take it?
I can take it first, guys. Sure. So basically, it's first of all, it was approved. They proposed the policy back in January, the first draft of the policy, and they asked for public. They put it out for public opinion, and a lot of researchers and kind of community AI communities, they provided the feedbacks for this policy, and they did some amendment. And this last Monday, they approved this final version. So basically, this policy wants to regulate the use of AI systems for policing. And so the framework they used was based on the risk level of the AI system. They try to provide some safeguards and mechanism on how to ensure that these AI systems, if used by police services by Toronto Police Force, is going to be used in a responsible manner and take the proper guardrail to kind of create that accountability for the police force if they start using this AI systems. Just in a nutshell. You go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll interject very quickly for those of you who are less familiar with what we are talking about. Probably people from all over the place are watching this, or will watch it later. There is a link in the video description on YouTube. The very first link. If you click on it, a lot of the resources that we are referencing in this conversation are there. You can take a look at them. You can see our notes about them, and you can specifically see the original ask for feedback and the consequent, our response, and then a lot of other things. But we responded to this. Why did we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was a great just opportunity for our community with Aggregate Intellect. Like Samaya and I have been running this AI ethics, machine learning ethics community for a year and a half or so. And, along the way, we've gathered together a lot of great people with, lots of great ideas and lots of great passion for this area. And this seemed like a really great way for our community to kind of do something and have some impact in the real world. And for many of us, like the city that we live in. And for me personally, like this is the sort of thing that like I'd hope to see everywhere. I mean, I think, and a big part of what our response emphasized was like the need for community feedback, public consultation. So, I think that's really valuable in the sort of governance of any AI technologies being deployed on the public. And so this was kind of a first step of actually like making that happen and, giving our perspective on what they were proposing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like our community, the Aggregate Intellect is such a multidisciplinary community, and I felt like we, myself and Billy, we felt like that we are very well situated to actually comment on this policy. We have people from very different backgrounds, which I want to shout out to all of them who contribute they were mentioned in that report, that they came into, and in a short time, and I think we had about 3 weeks to provide our comments, and when we kind of first heard about this, the public opinion. So they all were on board, they dedicated their time and resources, and we sat down and prepared this. So it was a great community effort, absolutely, yeah.
So just to be cautious of time, I actually wanted to kind of go over your entire response, but I'm going to start with the specific one that I'm really, really curious about. Within the policy, I read that there's quite a bit, there's mention, of course, whenever we talk about AI, there's mention of bias. And then part of the response, if I understood it correctly, was to the suggestion to distinguish between different types of biases. And going back to that terminological discussion we had at the beginning, I know there's historical, representation, measurement, and population, at least. Want to walk us through, as I know we have people both from the UX and product world, not just AI, listening to us, kind of what do those mean? And what exactly do you look at the data set to know, or how do you even answer? Like, how do you know, is there going to be measurement bias? Is there going to be...
This is a big one. Maybe I'll take a crack at some of it, and I'm sure Samaya will have more to add. Okay, so like part of the things that we're talking about here are, in addition to considering whether, the model itself kind of is biased towards certain groups of individuals. So maybe it favors these types of people over these types of people, or disfavors this other group of people over this other group. We also need to be thinking about, well, so like the data that the model was trained on, is that data set, itself kind of the result of biased data collection practices. So for example, if we're looking at, predictive policing technologies, and I'm saying that in heavy scare quotes, that are looking at sort of like the history of crime, also in scare quotes, this data is this data has been, affected by the realities of how policing has been practiced over, the last several decades, centuries, really. So, we need to ask, like, okay, is this data that we have, like, is this data itself of like where crime is happening and who is committing the crime, is this like an accurate sort of even collection of this sort of data, or has it been influenced by how it has been collected? There's concerns about like whether the population that you have sampled in your training data, are they representative of the population at large? And you see this a lot in AI context, because you're often like dealing with these technologies that are meant to scale, but then, even just kind of like having a model that was trained on like data in Georgia and then applying that to data in Toronto, like that might not really be a great like transfer. Like these populations aren't exactly the same. So these are like a couple of the things that immediately jump to mind. And one thing I want to emphasize is that for a lot of these things, like to determine whether your data is biased or whether your model will be biased by this data, you can't just look at the data alone. You need to be kind of taking that data, understanding that data in its context, in its historical and social context. And this kind of goes back to the point that Samaya was saying before about like interdisciplinarity being really key here, because the like understanding this stuff is not going to be like the sole purview of data scientists or statisticians. We need these other perspectives that are going to bring a deeper perspective to this data and that stuff.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I explained it really well. Like I think that if I remember correctly, they were referring to biases in data, because I sometimes feel like the term bias has been not fully understood. It's the context that you using the word bias means a lot. It changes what you're referring to. So I'm guessing that was what you were referring was the bias in regarding the data, kind of sort of data measurement, we may say, because we can have biases when it comes to the model output or model development, having biases while you're doing the design and design of the AI system, or kind of shaping of the business case for it, or even during the entire process of developing an AI system. But that was specifically regarding I think the data, because there were some mentions in the provision that they're going to be using some social media, maybe data, which are known of being very poor quality and contains tons of biases, population biases, measurement biases, or the content biases. So depending on which platform you're using, data will certainly going to be different. So these are important kind of elements, but as Billy mentioned, you cannot isolate them and say, okay, we measured for population biases, we measured for this. It in a context, they make sense in a context that needs to be studied and addressed. And this is my take on it.
Yeah, so that element of the bigger picture, that I think, and we talked in the previous episode with Scott and Jennifer too, like the idea of ecosystem, like capturing all of the interactions, both people and systems, related to that data, as opposed to looking at it in isolation. And something tying that to your response, something else that was in there, I like that Toronto Police actively specified, we want to measure the impact after deployment. And just like you, I did not like that it's for a limited period of time. So can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, in the original draft policy, there were several sections about model monitoring and kind of continuous review and evaluation of models that are being used by the police service. And this was a sticking point for many of the respondents to the draft policy. And it was a place where they did make some changes. Which is good to see. I mean, I think they took seriously the critique that these reviews need to be happening faster, more frequently. We can't just like wait for this stuff to happen. And so that was good to see for sure.
So if I broaden that question a little, normally in situations like that, we take a risk management approach to dealing with the problem. And I believe they define several levels of risk and corresponding action items. And I believe you took quite a bit of issue with the action items and their definitions of risk. And of course, if that's not done right, like bias is a very good example of, a risky component of the systems that we are dealing with. But there are other types of components that can result in risk. So what were the most problematic either risk categories or action items they define for each of the categories?
I can maybe take a first crack. So the first draft, the first provision, those risk category, in my opinion, was kind of inspired by some of the risk currently global initiative regarding the AI policy, which they have a similar framework for categorizing risk associated with AI system, which basically we have a prohibited cases, extremely high cases, basically, then high case, medium, low. So I feel like they got that approach based on some existing research and some other policy initiative. But one thing, in my opinion, is there are certain cases, let's say using AI for predictive policing, these are high stake cases. This is very well known, but there are sometimes cases that the predicting the risk might not be very easy at the beginning. You might never think that using a language model might be a risky case, but it depends what is the use case you are going to deploy that NLP. And that could become actually a very high risk or even prohibited case. So it's so hard to, I think it's a nature of the risk when it comes to AI system is very dynamic. It just acknowledging this fact and being cognizant of this fact is really important. I guess that was what we intended in our response to kind of to highlight.
So what was the recommendation to address that?
What was our recommendation to address that? Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of what we did in our response was just emphasize that, like, okay, if you're going to adopt this risk assessment framework, like fine, let's go forward with that, and let's just explain why many of the technologies you're considering should be deemed like extreme or high risk and basically a no-go. Because like that's how I'd prefer this policy to actually work. Like I'm not sure what I think about risk assessment frameworks in general. Like this might not be the way that I would have crafted the policy from the get-go, but in our response, we wanted to kind of take on their framework, like take their framework on board, kind of build off of what they had. And I think the real potential here is that, okay, if this is your framework, if you want to like think about risk levels of AI technology, well, with proper review, I think you'll see that most technologies you'd be considering are not worth the risk. They're just way too risky. So I think that's like the real potential for a policy like this. And especially if we can incorporate the right sort of independent review, where it's not just kind of like the police rubber stamping their own ideas for like what they want to implement. This is why you need like an independent panel of experts or someone like assessing it from the outside. With the right sort of review, like the risk assessment framework would do what I want it to do, which is like block a lot of stuff from happening.
I'm glad you brought that up because I'm always curious. Like these are really complex problems, right? Like everything around this, that there's no easy solution. So when we talk about having a team of experts in place, what sort of people with, I guess, what disciplines or expertise do you think should be at the table at a minimum to kind of assess risk? I vote US.
I can take a first crack at it. I wouldn't put it that way. What minimum kind of requirement or what minimum expertise? I would try to look at that AI system from a broader lens. So when we talk about AI system, there are so many different dimensions. So it's about the people, it's about our planet, it's about the data, it's about just AI system. That the model is just one dimension, right? So it's about what else? It's planet. It's also about the output it produces. Also, one thing that I always wanted to maybe I would like to talk more about this is the economic impact. So using an AI system, let's say in healthcare versus using it in manufacturing, they are completely different contexts. So if you look at an AI system model, all the dimension of those AI system specific case, then you would know, okay, what disciplines, what expertise needs to be in the room to address all these dimensions. It depends on the case, right? So I think having this view when developing an AI system would be the best way to identify the risk level associated to that system.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, like, in addition to experts, we also emphasize the need for there to be just ordinary, non-expert people from the community that are involved with giving feedback on these technologies. And like, I'm not in favor of an approach which is just a panel of technocratic experts. I think like that can have a lot of problems too with the sort of decisions that they'll make or that they'll think are right, even if they're kind of a multidisciplinary, diverse group of people. So, ultimately, like, this stuff, like these technologies are going to be, deployed in people's communities, presumably for their benefit, or purportedly for their benefit. And people should have a say whether, like, does this feel like the right trade-off? Like, okay, like maybe this will bring some marginal improvements to community safety. Is that worth the cost of mass surveillance? People should have a say in that.
For sure.
Sorry. No, that was a very good point. I wanted to actually something about a quote from the that data feminism book that we actually, myself and Billy, we had a book club for that, and we went through that with a group of our group of people from our community. There's actually a specific chapter on this, and they also talk about the most complete knowledge about something comes when you have different perspective into the discussion, and especially when you bring local and kind of minorities or indigenous community. So when we talk about people, we are not just talking about experts. We talk about everyone who eventually this sort of system is going to have an impact on them. So they should all have their voice represented at the table.
So I'll share with you the question that, so as I was reading the policy and then your response, one of the points was, right, exactly what you're saying. There will be a method for people to be able to give feedback on that AI technology. I haven't had the chance Monday to see the revised version, but your original one did not state what that method will be. And Samaya, you already brought up different populations, and a lot of the differences are also from a digital literacy perspective. So, and oftentimes there may be a relationship between the people who may be unfavored by some bias in algorithms and also this lack of literacy to, depending on what that method, it may imply you need internet, you need a Wi-Fi, you need a computer, you need. So I'm really curious what that method will be to actually include inclusiveness all throughout, so everyone is in a position to give feedback and even everyone becomes aware to start of this happening.
I think the literacy has another extension too. There is the literacy, like, do people understand what this even mean? Like, how is this going to impact their lives? Like, that's one component of it. The other component is access, as you say. Do they have access to the right information and tools to provide feedback, or even to understand what we are even asking? Like, that's a significant system design that I feel like they just completely glossed over. And as I hear from you, is probably one of the most important risk management components. And I say very quickly, I look to the side occasionally because I'm reading your comments in the chat. Please be like John and write comments. So John is saying that, yeah, explainability is very important. It is not always a fancy addition. I think we agree with you, John. And definitely risk management and dealing with biases, he thinks is a very important component. And he's asking, is it possible to even have enough experts around the table to address all the dimensions of the risk where AI systems are involved at some point? And how do we even go forward now? So I guess going back to Roxana's question, what do we do? It sounds like a very challenging problem.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me no more challenging or messy than politics and community organizing ever is. It's like, this stuff is always difficult. We haven't solved these problems, like, kind of incredibly, like, we've been living in society for thousands of years, but no, it's still like really difficult to bring everyone up. And I don't actually think it's like the police or the police services board's responsibility to fix all of those issues. But what they need to do is, like, allow for this possibility, which I think they actually are. So they've made real commitments to transparency over the AI technologies that they'll be implementing. That's a huge first step. Like, we're going to be able to see with, I think, some degree of detail, like, all of the sort of technologies currently under deployment. I think maybe even some being considered. And, that will allow community activists to actually use that information and get people to organize around this stuff. Like, so I don't want to pretend like we're in this sort of social vacuum where we need everyone independently on their own to, like, be able to engage with the stuff at the same level. What we need is, like, for a general kind of framework that allows for real, like, public action to take place. And I think what I'm seeing so far is an actual surprising amount of openness from the police services board onto what they're doing. Yeah. So that keeps me a bit hopeful.
Do you remember how many responses were submitted to their call?
45, I believe. And there were 5 or 6 deputations at the board meeting from members of the public. So, people are paying attention to this. And, a lot of the responses were from organizations, right? And, like, we're an organization, again, but there are other coalitions, committees, academic groups. So people are keeping an eye on this, and I think, like, people like that especially will keep moving for actions to be taken.
And they also took a significant number of our suggestions probably overlap with other people's suggestions.
Yeah, that's right.
I was gonna say, oftentimes when I'm on panels and I hear people talk about AI, we start with like the definitions, and then somehow it goes into what can go wrong. But I wanted to ask everyone, like, because somehow those don't make it in the conversation. What are those examples where AI has clearly improved things for the better? Because we keep talking about biases and all these things, but clearly AI is good too. So let's not forget that, if we can spell out some examples.
Maybe I can take a first crack, but it's I feel like so far in maybe in medicine discovery, and it seems that there has been some very good news. Maybe also there have been some cases that AI system has been used for public good. Being able, I mean, by international organization they have been using these systems to predict flooding in certain regions that they are very vulnerable, and so kind of being able to help them and provide them kind of support ahead of time. There are this use cases that you can see, and it has some positive impact, but it's in a very specific domain, right? But again, this is based to the best of my knowledge.
I was reading a paper on a robot called Pepper, I think. And the idea was that Pepper can conduct interviews, whether it's for a job or in a medical context. And part of me kept thinking, it's like, if you're having an interview, or even more in a medical context, you want that human component, and maybe Pepper is not ready to look or feel like a human. But on the other hand, the points made in the paper were things like, well, humans get tired, have biases, the other kind of biases, like cognitive biases. They may say things that trigger someone with PTSD or on the spectrum, or that they just don't have that, they're not trained to have that perfect communication on the spot to respond to a medical condition, or even be completely neutral across interviews and so on. So that was a really interesting example. I couldn't envision myself having had my interview for my current job with a robot. But
so on the point of examples and use cases, I'm going to reiterate that we have a link in the show notes that has a lot of resources you can use to see more about this, and a lot of them are use cases like what Roxana just talked about, examples of when things went wrong. All right. On the topic of data for good that we were just talking about, I saw a note that I believe either Willie or somebody wrote that there's a difference between data for good and data for coliberation.
Yeah, I was sharing this. This came out of again, that book Data Feminism that we read about a year ago now. Great book, highly recommend it. I don't know. I'm not going to do the best job of rehearsing this right now, so maybe this is a good opportunity to look at that list of resources. But the basic idea is that so in addition to like all the stuff we were talking about at the very start, like responsible AI, ethical AI, all of that, you also see a lot of like AI or data for good, for social good, and things like that. The book makes a sharp critique and a good criticism of these sorts of efforts and what they actually kind of mean in the end. And the basic idea is that data for good is often sort of these like initiatives. Often they're like in the form of hackathons that are, I totally believe like always well-intentioned and interested in making some like positive change in the community, but doing one that really leaves the existing power structures in place. And this comes at the cost of like, not being able to make any of those like more kind of like radical challenges to the structural systems that are actually causing the problem in the first place. And because of that, these sort of like quickly hack together solutions often have very limited impact because no one kind of sticks around to actually make sure to like maintain them, and because they're just, you know, they fall under the weight of the systems that they're within. So data for Coliberation, in contrast, is a much more kind of collaborative, participatory way of going about these projects, which is not just, you know, a group of tech nerds swooping in for a weekend and hacking away a solution for some inner city problem, but actually a community of, you know, tech people or whoever else developing lasting relationships in context within a community, and partnerships to ultimately bring those people, bring, like, what should I say? Really like address the root of the problem that the people in the community are facing.
People are writing in the chat a lot of examples around the good uses of AI. Recommendation on Netflix, but it is downplayed because that's for leisure. I'm sure you have a lot of examples like that. Moez Ali is talking about how AI was reading how AI created something for live transcription for deaf people. So YouTube does have that. It automatically transcribes what we're saying and displays that. And yes, there are a lot of good examples like drug discovery, as Somaya was talking about a little earlier. A lot of work on cancer detection definitely is a big example. But yeah, definitely we have to give a fair balance to the two sides. On the community-based side of things and collaboration, which is a new term that I learned today, I think as a community builder and somebody who has been involved in, you know, a fairly large community for the past few years, that's a very, very interesting topic for me because as I think one of you mentioned, we literally pulled people together, and I think 10, 12 people participated in writing the response. We pulled all of this together within days, literally, and then the response was written within a couple of weeks before we submitted. So, and that's the power of a community. And definitely, if the community is leveraged properly, then there could be an ongoing line of feedback and you know, governance that can exist without having to rely on single points of failure that usually we use in the current existing systems. So what are some actual pragmatic ways that this can happen in reality? And by the way, Roxana, are you jealous that Ottawa police didn't do this kind of call for action? I'm just kidding.
I was going to say, I'm a big fan of, I think it goes back to this interdisciplinary reunion and then bringing as many voices, diverse voices and expertise. And by expertise, I don't mean like technical expertise, just like overall throughout AI, UX, people from the public, and so on. One thing that's challenging though is, I mean, now a lot of these studies used to be done in person, you know, fill a wall with sticky notes and we all work together. But now all of a sudden we're a bit widening again the gap because now everyone can just jump on Zoom and join these or be exposed to these events happening in the first place. So I think we still need to work towards expanding towards this inclusiveness in a fully digital environment. But aside from that, I do think, you know, the power of community bringing people together. And that's one of the reasons that I joined this show in the first place, is because clearly I'm not very fully technical when it comes to AI. But what I feel really strongly about is bringing together the AI and the UX and how we can complement each other. And the whole, like every single episode we've had, I think there was an example or of how we may say the same, well, the same word, but mean different things. We talked about like a Twitter example, you know, like what's a tweet? It's just some words versus a few hundred variables with geolocation and so on. Today we talked about cognitive biases. I teach that lesson, and it means like biases, to me, it meant something completely different than what we talked about today. And I think it's really important that we get together and have these conversations, for otherwise we can't solve complex solutions or complex problems. Sorry, I'm too passionate about bridging the two. I don't know why I went there. I always go there.
Another thing that I want to add, I think, so one thing that I think needs to happen here is for, what do I want to say? Like, people who are interested in these sort of like ethical and societal issues with AI need to recognize that these are not just kind of issues that are unique to AI. And we need to like broaden the community to not just be about people who care about machine learning and technology, but really see this as continuous with like many other groups who, of course, like probably, in many cases pre-existed for much longer. And so I think about like the example of Stop LAPD Spying, which, is an organization that was successful in getting the Los Angeles Police Department to, I believe, stop their predictive policing program. Maybe also some pushback on facial recognition. But, this wasn't like a community of tech experts, though I'm sure like there were some like among them. But this was a much broader community that was concerned with, policing more generally. And I think like the concerns that tech people have about technology in policing are really continuous with like concerns that many other people have had just with policing in general. So I think we need to keep thinking about how we can continue to widen this circle and see us as part of like a larger community who's dealing with these issues.
I quite agree. This, I think, really very well covered that. But I think all of us who are involved in development of AI in one way or another. So I think personally feeling that responsibility that I need to kind of take part in something that's going to have a permanent sometimes or significant impact on human life and human rights and fundamental rights. So kind of having this sort of this maybe a passion or this concern about this kind of encourages people to get more active in activities like this. And some of the government, some of the public sector, some of them maybe across the world, they have been really actually good in this case. They've started comprehensive initiative to get the public engaged, bring the feedbacks. And I feel like just acknowledging these activities and get actively participating, I think it will be, it's something that we can certainly as a community do that and encourage our community to take an active role for sure.
All right, we're almost out of time. I was going to ask for retrospectives, but I think this last round kind of turned out to be retrospective. I'm going to quickly show something to the audience. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can see that. This is, what I talked about a few times, the list of, 15 different resources that you can take a look at, the original, the call from the police and our response are the first couple of items on the list that you can take a look at. But there are a lot of other resources, like you can really get deep into this topic. And if you have suggestions about what else, we should have included, please reach out. I'm going to use this opportunity to wrap up this session very quickly by saying that as a community in AI, we really care about sustainability, environmental effects, ethical side of responsible side of AI, social aspects that are either data for good or using data for Coliberation. I'm going to use that buzzword a lot. And I'm going to, have an open call for anybody who uses AI in the, developers, product people, executives, all the way to people in governance and policy. Reach out to us. We are always interested in questions like that. It doesn't have to be Toronto. We have a very global community. Wherever you are, even Ottawa, where Roxana is, we are very welcoming. Join us to have conversations like this. But also those who are in power, in charge, reach out to us. We can provide feedback. And as you saw in the Toronto police case, they really liked a lot of the things that we had to say. It's a really strong community of experts. People like ourselves can learn from each other, from the peers, but people in charge can also get a lot of helpful feedback at a very low cost because we are very enthusiastic to participate. On that note, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure there is a ton more to talk about, but unfortunately, we only have an hour, about 55 minutes, I guess. If you have more questions, leave them as comments. There is a link to our Slack channel. You can join there. And feel free to reach out to Willie, Samaya, and Roxana and myself if you have any questions. We are happy to provide our thoughts. And as you see, we are very opinionated. We love talking. Thank you so much. Hope to see you next week. Oh, actually, we are doing a session on Friday this week, and a special session on Friday about environmental data science, because we have a very large initiative kicked off in collaboration with the Government of Canada to educate the public about environmental data science. So join us for that session to learn more about it. And next week on Wednesday, do you remember what we were talking about, Roxana?
No,
I don't remember either. Oh, damn
it. Special session next Friday.
Right. Yes. All right. We will make announcements on social media and everywhere. Please join us. All right. Thank you so much for joining. And we will see you next time.
Everyone.
Bye.
Oh, we're not live anymore, right? I can stretch.
Hold on.
Well, other people can stretch. Please stretch with me.